Imagine you hired a contractor, a decent guy, showed up on time every day for 5 years, never complained, stayed late when the sprint was tight, turned down a competing offer once, actually, because he felt a loyalty to the team. You found out about that later from someone else, which is how you know it was real. Then the company restructured, his role was eliminated. Very professional, 2 weeks severance, HR handled everything cleanly. You shook his hand on his last day and meant every word of the goodbye. 6 months later, you need someone for a new project. He's exactly right for it. You call him. He doesn't answer. You try again the following week. Nothing. You send a LinkedIn message. He reads it. You can see the receipt and does not respond. And you are genuinely confused. You think, I treated him well, I gave him 2 weeks, I told HR to be professional, I even shook his hand. What exactly is the problem here? The problem is that you think the story ended when you decided it ended. He thinks the story ended 6 months earlier, on the day you decided his contributions of 5 years were worth approximately 14 days of transition time. That gap, the distance between those two timelines, between the company's clean narrative and the employee's experienced reality, that gap is the entire Gen Z loyalty conversation in one sentence, before we've even started. Companies spent 20 years perfecting the art of replacing people efficiently, downsizing, right-sizing, automating, outsourcing, strategic restructuring. There's a different word for every decade, but the mechanism is identical. Someone who contributed gets removed when the math shifts slightly, very politely, very legally. And now those same companies are confused, sincerely, genuinely confused that an entire generation who watched all of that happen in high definition, in real time, starting when they were 12 years old, has exactly zero interest in bleeding for an org chart they correctly understand to be temporary. So, here's the question that should be setting up this entire conversation. Is this Gen Z being difficult? Is this a values collapse? Is it entitlement, soft skills, short attention spans? Or is this what rational behavior looks like when a generation learns from data that previous generations didn't have? We're going to explain how the loyalty economy actually works and why it's getting weird. Not from a feelings angle, not from a generational values lecture, from an incentives perspective, because I genuinely do not think this is a story about character. I think it's a story about contracts. The contract changed, the behavior changed with it, and the people who are still angry about the behavior are the ones who haven't looked at the contract yet. Let me introduce you to the metaphor I'm going to use for this entire video because it matters. Think about a vending machine, old school, the kind that's been sitting in a corporate break room since 1993, humming quietly, slightly scratched, you know the one. The deal with a vending machine is completely simple. You put in a coin, you press a button, something comes out, that's the contract. It doesn't require trust, it doesn't require relationship management, it requires the machine to do exactly what it says it does. For roughly 40 years, the corporate workplace ran exactly like that machine. You put in loyalty, time, consistency, sacrifice, geographic stability, a willingness to absorb the bad years quietly, and out came security, career progression, a pension eventually. The same job at the same company for 30 years, and then a retirement party with a sheet cake and a card everyone signed in the break room. That was the machine, and for a while it worked. And then slowly, over a period of about 20 years, the machine started eating coins without dispensing anything. Layoffs in profitable quarters, roles eliminated, replaced by cheaper software, outsourced to a vendor. Your position has been eliminated. This is not a reflection of your performance. Very professional, very regrettable. Gen Z grew up watching their parents feed coins to that machine for 30 years and get nothing in the end. So, they made a very clean, very logical decision: stop feeding the machine. That's actually the entire video. But, the reason I think it's worth 10,000 words is that the surface version, companies were disloyal so workers became disloyal, misses about 7 layers of what's actually happening, and those 7 layers are where the money is, both figuratively and literally. So, let's go through them. The first thing most people get wrong about the loyalty conversation is that they assume the original contract was explicit, that there was some document that both sides sat down, read the terms, agreed to the conditions, and signed something. There was no document. There was a social norm, and social norms are a completely different type of agreement than a contract. Social norms work through shared expectations, cultural enforcement, and mutual benefit. They're remarkably stable under normal conditions, but they have a specific weakness. If one side stops following the norm while the other side still is, the person still following it is simply losing. The unwritten workplace contract, the one that prevailed from roughly the 1950s through the early 1990s, went something like this. You give us your best years. You show up, you absorb the boring and the hard. You don't leave for competitors when they offer you slightly more money. You modulate your salary expectations during the bad years. In return, we keep you. We promote you over time. We build your pension. We take care of you when you're old. You become a lifer, and the company treats lifer status as something worth protecting. This contract worked well enough that people organized their entire lives around it. Mortgages anchored to stable employment, geographic routes built around a single employer, retirement planning that assumed decades of continuous pension accrual. The whole architecture of middle-class life in the 20th century was built on this implicit agreement holding. And then two forces hit simultaneously, and the timing is actually important because it explains why people still misdiagnose the cause. Force 1: global competition. Companies that had been structurally insulated from price competition by geography suddenly weren't. Domestic manufacturers, service providers, back-office operations, all of them suddenly facing competitors who could do the same work for a fraction of the cost. And the fastest available lever to close that cost gap was labor, which is a professionally acceptable way of saying fire people. Force 2: shareholder primacy is explicit corporate doctrine, the formalization of the idea that the only obligation of a public company is to maximize returns for shareholders every quarter with no meaningful weight given to employee welfare, community impact, or long-term organizational health. Returns now, not in 3 years, now. Those two forces arrived within years of each other, and when they did, the contract started breaking at scale. By the late 1990s, mass layoffs were not a desperate last resort, they were an earnings management strategy. There was a documented observable period where announcing significant headcount cuts consistently caused a company's stock price to rise. This is not a cynical interpretation. You can look at the data from the restructuring wave of the 90s and watch market cap climb in response to layoff announcements. The machine was rewarding contract breaking in real time. So, here's the foundational point, and I want to say it clearly because it tends to get lost in the generational framing. The loyalty contract didn't die because Gen Z decided to kill it. It died because companies made an economically rational decision to kill it, driven by structural market forces and an incentive framework that rewarded short-term optimization over long-term relationship investment. And they were then surprised, genuinely surprised, when the other side of the table eventually made the same calculation. If you are surprised by that, I want to gently suggest that you might need to think harder about what a contract actually is, because a contract is a bilateral thing. You cannot unilaterally terminate the obligations on your side and expect the other parties to remain fully in effect. That is not how any agreement works, not legally, not socially, not psychologically. But here's the layer that's more interesting than the obvious part. When the contract breaks, it doesn't break symmetrically. The company has a legal team, an HR department, severance structures, official processes for managing exits. Everything is clean, documented, legally sound. The individual has whatever they personally managed to build during the period they trusted which, if they spent 10 years giving genuine loyalty to one employer, is usually not much. Their network is internal to that company. Their skills may have specialized toward internal systems that aren't transferable. Their financial cushion depends on how carefully they save from a salary that, because they didn't leave, was growing slower than the external market rate. So, the contract didn't just break. It broke asymmetrically, consistently, in a direction that left the loyal employee worse off than the one who treated every employer as temporary. And this happened enough times across enough industries and demographics and decades that the pattern became legible. You think the loyalty problem is a values problem, but it's a broken contract problem, and the values changed because the contract changed first. The values are downstream. The contract is upstream. Now, let me show you the specific mechanism by which a replacement sends signals that travel far beyond the individual being replaced, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting from a systems perspective. Imagine you have an employee been with you for 4 years, mid-level, solid performer, not exceptional, not a problem, just reliably good. You have an opportunity to hire someone externally who looks better on paper. Strong resume, came from a more prestigious company, slightly more impressive background. You make the move. You restructure the role slightly. The 4-year person is managed out, handled professionally. You actually feel okay about it because you believe it was the right business decision. From where you're sitting, you optimized. You made the better hire. Clean economic logic, slightly awkward, but necessary. Now, let me tell you what you actually communicated, not just to the person who left, but to everyone who watched. You communicated that 4 years of consistent performance, institutional knowledge, and demonstrated cultural fit is worth less than a more impressive resume. That's the literal message, and everyone in the room received it. You communicated that loyalty, when the alternative is a more attractive external option, is not a meaningful variable in the decision. Not zero, but very close to zero relative to the other factors. And everyone did the math on that. And you communicated, most importantly, that the optimal survival strategy at this company is not to be loyal, it's to be irreplaceable. These are not the same strategy. They're actually in tension with each other, because the behaviors required to build genuine irreplaceability, developing external visibility, building portable skills, maintaining a market value that the company has to compete with, those behaviors look from the inside like preparing to leave. Loyalty says, I stay, I contribute, I trust the relationship to protect me when things get hard. Irreplaceability says, I build leverage that makes removing me costly regardless of whether you trust the relationship or not. The 4-year, snorts, employee was playing the loyalty strategy. The external hire was rewarded for playing the irreplaceability strategy. Everyone in the room updated their model accordingly. And this is the second-order effect that most managers don't account for, because the incentive structure of the individual manager doesn't require them to. The hiring manager who makes that optimization gets credit for the good hire. They're evaluated on team output, not on the cultural recalibration that just happened to everyone who watched. That cost is diffuse. It lands on future managers who wonder why their teams have lower engagement. It lands on future retention numbers that HR puzzles over in an annual report. The decision maker captures the benefit, the organization absorbs the cost. This is textbook short-termism, localized benefit, diffuse delayed cost. And it is one of the primary reasons the contract kept breaking, even when everyone at some intellectual level understood that it was breaking. The visible replacement is not a local event, it is a broadcast. And if you're building any kind of organization right now, a company, a team, a brand, even a small business, understanding this is worth more than any leadership seminar you will ever attend. The signal you send when you replace someone travels farther and sticks longer than the efficiency you gained from the optimization. The vending machine doesn't just lose the coin from the person who walked away, it loses the coins from everyone who watched. And the machine is too focused on its quarterly maintenance schedule to notice. If this kind of systems-level thinking about money, work, and incentives is useful to you, subscribe. I'm not posting motivation, I'm posting mechanics. And mechanics compound. Now, let me walk you through a specific scenario. I'm going to call the person Marcus. Fictional, but realistic enough that if you've worked in any corporate environment in the last decade, you will recognize every single beat. Marcus is 26. He got his first real job at 22, a mid-size B2B software company, about 350 employees. He's in sales operations. He's genuinely good at the job, not loud about it, not politically savvy, just technically sharp and reliable. In his first year, he figures out a workflow automation that saves his team somewhere around 8 hours a week. He doesn't announce this in a big internal presentation, he just deploys it and it works. His manager notices, tells him he's valued. There are vague conversations about a path upward. By year 2, he's making $58,000 a year. He hasn't pushed hard for a raise because the culture feels warm. His manager is someone he respects. He turns down a recruiter inquiry because he's genuinely invested in where things are going. Year 3, the company brings in a new VP of Revenue, external hire, big name previous employer on the resume. The new VP has a mandate to grow quickly and wants to build the team in her own image. Marcus's manager, the one who recognized his work, who knew the systems Marcus built, gets quietly moved to a different department in a move that is described as a broadening of scope. A new team lead is brought in from outside, someone the VP has worked with before. This person's compensation is $85,000 a year. Marcus is now reporting to someone who doesn't know the automation Marcus built, doesn't know the workflow logic, doesn't know who Marcus actually is. And this person is being paid 60% more than Marcus to nominally lead a team that Marcus was, in functional terms, already helping to run. Marcus does not storm out, he doesn't send a passive-aggressive Slack message, he doesn't do dramatic. He just updates his LinkedIn to open to opportunities. He takes a few recruiter calls he would have ignored a year ago. Nothing aggressive, but the calculation has clearly and permanently changed. 6 months later, a growing company in an adjacent space offers him $68,000. Better title, more ownership. He takes it. His old company now needs to fill his role. Recruiting fees, job posting costs, interview cycles that pull senior people's time, onboarding and training for whoever they hire, and then the knowledge gap, the months of reduced efficiency while the new person learns systems they don't understand, makes mistakes Marcus wouldn't have made, rebuilds context that Marcus carried in his head. Conservatively, this cost them somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 in direct costs. If you include lost productivity fully, some estimates put the total replacement cost for a mid-level employee at 50% to 200% of their annual salary. So, somewhere between $29,000 and $116,000 to replace someone who is making $58,000. To replace someone who had already been replaced functionally by a more expensive external hire. Let me just hold that for a second. And now here is the financial punchline that closes the Marcus story. Marcus, over the course of his career, by leaving instead of staying and trusting the vague promotion path, will likely earn somewhere between $150,000 and $300,000 more in cumulative compensation than he would have if he'd stayed. This is not speculation. This is one of the most consistent and well-documented patterns in labor economics. External hires routinely receive higher compensation than internal promotions for equivalent roles. The gap varies by industry, but it is almost never zero, and it is almost always in favor of the person who left. The math rewards leaving consistently across most industries, in most markets, most of the time. And Gen Z did the math. Now, here's what I think is the genuinely strange and interesting part of this moment in history. The word replacement has been so normalized in corporate language, used so casually, handled so professionally that most people don't stop to register how radical the underlying logic actually is. Think about what it means to replace a person. In the context of a machine, replacement is neutral, mechanical. You replace a worn component, the machine keeps running, the component has no feelings about this, no one mourns the part. Somewhere between the early 1980s and the 2010s, this logic got quietly and systematically applied to human labor industrial scale. And the people doing the applying had defensible reasons: market pressure, competition, the genuine need to evolve organizations over time. I'm not saying they were acting in bad faith. I'm saying the aggregate effect was that workers started being implicitly categorized as parts, interchangeable, replaceable, subject to the same optimization logic as any other input cost. And when you categorize a person as a part, you should not be surprised when they start behaving like one. A part has no attachment to the machine. A part doesn't care about the machine's output. A part goes where the specification matches and the price is right. A part does not volunteer discretionary effort, whatever extra energy and investment it takes to go beyond the minimum required, because discretionary effort is not a commodity behavior. It's a relationship behavior. And relationships require mutual investment to produce. This is the logical endpoint of the commoditization of labor. If you treat labor as an interchangeable commodity, labor will behave like a commodity. It will route to wherever the price is highest. It will show no preference beyond price. It will not accept below-market compensation in exchange for stability, because stability is not something a commodity receives from its buyer. Commodities are bought and sold. That's the whole relationship. Now, here's the layer that changes everything. The replacement economy didn't just alter how workers behave. It altered the information environment workers operate in. And the information environment is where the Gen Z story gets genuinely surprising. Previous generations made loyalty bets with incomplete information. They couldn't see the full picture. A person entering the workforce in 1985 didn't have access to a detailed history of how their employer had treated employees during the previous restructuring. They didn't know the median tenure at the company. They didn't know what the internal promotion rate looked like versus the external hire rate. They couldn't easily compare their compensation to market rate. They made the bet because the bet was culturally expected and because the information required to price the bet accurately was simply not available. Gen Z entered the workforce with that information. Not perfectly, not always, but radically more of it than any previous generation. LinkedIn showing salary ranges, Glassdoor aggregating departure stories and layoff accounts, Reddit threads from thousands of people who stayed too long and ended up holding nothing. TikTok, which has an entire genre, a genuine thriving high-engagement genre of people filming themselves finding out they've been laid off, processing it in real time with millions of views. The emotional and informational content of what the machine actually does to people is now a searchable, scrollable, always available archive. Companies send company-wide emails about how deeply they value their people. Their former employees post the details of their separation agreement on a public forum. Gen Z reads both simultaneously before they accept the offer. So, the loyalty gap between Gen Z and prior generations is not at its root a gap in values. It is a gap in information access. Previous generations made loyalty bets with asymmetric information. The company knew far more about its own intentions and track record than the employee did. Gen Z closes that information asymmetry significantly, and behavior that seems irrational with one information set often looks completely rational with a better one. Here's a parallel that might help. Imagine if every restaurant publicly posted its health inspection scores and full ingredient lists in a format anyone could instantly access before deciding where to eat. Dining behavior would change. Not because people's values about food changed, because they now have accurate information about what they're actually getting. Calling that change in behavior disloyal to restaurants would be missing the point at fundamental level. Now, here's the money layer, because that's the part one actually care about, and I suspect it's the part you came for. When labor behaves like a commodity, standard commodity economic supply, price goes to the margin. The best performers, the ones with genuine leverage, rare skills, external optionality, and the ability to negotiate, extract maximum value through mobility. The middle competes on volume and availability, which drives wages toward equilibrium with supply. The bottom falls out for anyone whose skills are genuinely substitutable, whether by a cheaper human or by technology. This bifurcation of the labor market is not a policy failure, despite what every political speech on the subject implies. It is the direct and predictable mathematical outcome of commoditizing labor over several decades. The top decile of workers saw real wage growth through the 2010s. The middle got squeezed, the bottom got automated, and the response from the generation that saw this pattern clearly, they are explicitly and deliberately not trying to be loyal mid-level employees. They are trying to get to the top decile as fast as possible, not through seniority. They know seniority doesn't work the way it used to, through skills and leverage, through building things that are genuinely hard to replace, through creating what I'd call position scarcity, where your value is not describable in a standard job description, and therefore cannot be replaced by a standard hiring process. The freelance economy, the creator economy, the consulting at 24 phenomenon, the personal brand, the side income stack, these are not random cultural trends, and they are absolutely not just about passion or flexibility. They are rational responses to the incentive structure of the replacement economy. If loyalty doesn't compound and mobility does, you build a career that is structurally mobile. If employment is episodic and insecure, you diversify income sources. If the vending machine is broken, You stop queuing in front of the vending machine and find something else to eat. HR Department 2024, we are genuinely concerned that younger employees don't seem committed to long-term growth within the organization. Also, HR Department 2024, we're restructuring. Your team is being absorbed. Your role may or may not continue in some capacity. Someone from HR will be in touch by end of week. Anyway, Pizza Friday is still on. Hope to see everyone there. And here's the dark and genuinely ironic kicker to the replacement economy story, which I think most people haven't fully absorbed yet. The companies that most aggressively replaced workers, the ones that perfected the art of efficient human capital turnover, are also the companies building the technology that will eventually replace their own shareholders' knowledge work. The automation that was first deployed against manufacturing labor, then against clerical work, then against mid-level management functions, is now clearly targeting the professional and executive layers that spent the previous 30 years pointing the automation at everyone below them. So, we are in this genuinely strange moment where the machine is eating itself. The replacement economy produced the tools that will eventually displace a large portion of the workforce that ran the replacement economy. And the workers who adapted correctly, who built portable skills, who refused to make themselves structurally dependent on any single employer, who kept their optionality, those workers are meaningfully better positioned for that future than the loyal corporate lifers on any level of the org chart. LinkedIn post from a Fortune 500 company 2025, we are excited to announce our renewed commitment to employee well-being, long-term investment in our people, and building a culture of genuine belonging. Comment with 900 likes. This is the company that laid off 11% of its workforce last March and sent a Slack message at 6:45 in the morning. They cut the DEI team by 60% the same week they posted this. Reply from verified company account, we appreciate your feedback and would love to connect to discuss further. Nobody connected. Now, I want to give you a framework because everything we've been building to is really about understanding what people actually do in the contract breaks and what the financially intelligent move looks like at each stage. There are 3 levels of response to being replaced, 3 distinct patterns, and I've watched all 3 play out enough times that they feel almost mechanical now. Level 1 is what I call the confused loyalist. This is the person who gets replaced and cannot reconcile it with their internal model of how the world works. They put in real loyalty, they believed in the contract, and when the contract broke, they experienced it as a personal failure, some version of I must have done something wrong, or I wasn't good enough, rather than as a contract failure. So, they clean up their resume, they find another company, and they essentially run the same strategy again, same coins, different machine. They are betting that this time the machine will be different. Sometimes it is, but statistically, they're playing against a market where most machines are broken, and they haven't changed the strategy. The confused loyalist has not updated the model, and because they haven't updated the model, they are extremely likely to reach their late 40s or early 50s having provided genuine value to multiple employers and having very little to show for it structurally. Not because they didn't work hard, because they paid the wrong currency. Level 2 is the strategic mercenary. This is someone who gets replaced or watches someone get replaced and makes a clear-eyed decision to never let loyalty exceed their optionality again. They become very deliberate about mobility. They learn to negotiate. They treat every job as a temporary contract with a market value attached. They build skills specifically because skills are portable and loyalty isn't. They maintain an active network outside any single employer. They leave before they can be left. They always have conversations running in parallel. This is a genuine adaptation. It works. The strategic mercenary will, over a 20-year career, earn significantly more than the confused loyalist, potentially $200,000 to $400,000 more in cumulative compensation, depending on the industry, the pace of the mobility, and the quality of the skill building. But, there is a ceiling to the mercenary strategy, and the ceiling matters enormously for understanding where real wealth actually comes from. The mercenary strategy is fundamentally reactive and extractive. You are optimizing against a broken contract. You are taking from a series of machines. You are extracting value from each engagement, but because you are not in any engagement long enough for compound growth to kick in, and because you are building within someone else's system rather than your own, you are not compounding. You are running fast on a treadmill. The treadmill is moving faster than most, which feels like winning, but you're still on someone else's treadmill. Level 3 is the system builder. This is rare. This is the person who looks at the replacement economy and asks a fundamentally different question than either the loyalist or the mercenary. Not how do I survive this system? Not how do I extract maximum value from this system? But, how do I build something that operates outside this system's jurisdiction? The system builder uses their early years not to accumulate loyalty points or even to maximize short-term salary. They accumulate leverage, skills that live in their head, not in a job description, relationships that are real relationships, not just LinkedIn connections, capital that they deploy rather than hold. They build income streams that don't require their physical presence at specific desk at a specific time. They reduce their single points of failure, the places where one decision by one person at one company can completely reset their financial situation. They are usually not the most visible person in any room. They're often deliberately understated about what they're actually building because the thing they're building doesn't fit into the categories the machine recognizes. The machine doesn't know how to process them. And at some point, usually in their late 20s or early 30s, sometimes earlier, they cross a threshold. The system no longer applies to them in the same way it applies to the loyalist or even the mercenary. They can't be replaced by a restructuring because there's nothing to restructure. Their income has enough distribution that no single employer decision resets the board. They have leverage that is theirs and travels with them regardless of what any org chart does. Now, here's the critical thing about these three levels. All three are rational responses for the information available. The confused loyalist is operating on old information, the information that said loyalty pays, which was true for a specific historical period and is now wrong in most contexts. The mercenary is operating on current information, accurate, real-time, correctly priced. The system builder is operating on projected information. They're not just reading the current landscape. They're modeling where the compound effects of certain decisions lead over a 5 to 10-year horizon. The reason most people end up at level 1 or level 2 is not intelligence. Most people are plenty smart enough to understand the system builder logic when it's explained to them. The reason is time horizon. The system builder requires you to make decisions that look suboptimal in the short term. You might take a lower paying role that gives you a more valuable skill set. You might spend 3 years building something with no immediate financial return. You might stay at a company longer than a mercenary would because you're learning something that compounds, not because you're loyal to the company, but because the skill acquisition hasn't finished yet. These choices look weird to both the loyalist and the mercenary. The loyalist thinks you're being strategically cold. The mercenary thinks you're being strategically slow. But the system builder is playing a different game with a different time constant, and the compounding eventually becomes visible in a way that's hard to explain with the simpler models. The replacement economy by design runs on the shortest possible time constant. Quarterly earnings, annual headcount reviews, 18-month average manager tenure. It is structurally hostile to long-term thinking, and the machine short-termism is contagious. It keeps pulling everyone inside it toward the same time horizon. Every quarter, every review cycle, every replacement decision is a nudge toward shorter thinking. The system builder's edge is simply this. They resist the contagion. They hold a 2 to 5 year time horizon in an environment that screams quarterly. That's the arbitrage. It is not complicated. It does not require extraordinary intelligence or unusual risk tolerance. It requires the ability to hold a longer frame than the machine is pulling you towards. And here's something important I want to say about where we actually are in 2026, because the timeline matters. We are at a moment where the replacement economy is accelerating into its most aggressive phase yet, the automation of knowledge work. The previous phases replaced manufacturing labor, clerical labor, logistics. The current phase is entering professional and cognitive work in a way that was for most of the 2000s and 2010s theoretical. It's not theoretical anymore, which means the bifurcation I described earlier between the leveraged top diesel and the commoditized rest is going to accelerate. The middle of the knowledge work market is going to compress. The people who are in level 1, running the loyalty strategy, are going to find themselves exposed in ways they don't see coming. The level 2 mercenaries are going to find that mobility is only protective if the skills you're selling are genuinely hard to automate. And the level 3 system builders, the people who built leverage, distribution, and income structures that don't have a simple automated substitute, are going to find themselves in a position that looks from the outside like they were lucky. They were not lucky. They read the machine correctly. Now, let me bring in a layer that I think doesn't get discussed enough, which is what happens to the psychology of someone who gets replaced. Because the financial analysis is important, but the psychological shift is what actually drives the behavior. And if you want to understand why Gen Z refuses to return calls, you need to understand what replacement actually does to someone's mental model. When you get replaced, you learn one specific thing about how the world works. You learn that the contract you thought you had was not the contract the other party thought they had, and that's genuinely destabilizing, not just emotionally, but as an information update. Because if the contract you thought you had was wrong, what else is wrong? What other agreements in your life are based on assumptions that the other party doesn't share? The ripple effect is wider than the job. People who get replaced don't just update their behavior toward employers, they update their behavior toward institutions generally. They become more skeptical of stated values versus revealed values. They become more attentive to incentive structures. They become less willing to make major commitments based on implicit agreements and more interested in explicit, legible, verifiable ones. This is from a purely analytical perspective, an upgrade to the operating system, better calibration, less susceptibility to the gap between stated and actual intent, more sophisticated reading of the actual incentives at work. These are in most contexts highly functional traits. But they look from the outside, especially from the outside of the corporate institution that did the replacing, like disloyalty, cynicism, or failure to commit because the institution is still running on the old operating system that assumed implicit agreements were sufficient. It's a compatibility problem, two parties with different software versions trying to run the same application. And Gen Z, again, didn't have to learn this from a personal replacement event. They downloaded the updated operating system as social and cultural context long before they ever entered a professional environment. They grew up in a world where the gap between institutional stated values and institutional actual behavior was not just visible, it was a cultural reference point. Entire media ecosystems dedicated to documenting that gap, memes, viral threads, documentary series. The awareness of the gap is just baked in. So, the refusal to stay loyal after being replaced, the thing that reads as attitude, as values failure, as generational dysfunction, is actually the endpoint of a very coherent information processing chain. Institutional loyalty requires believing that the institution's stated commitments reflect its actual behavior. When that belief is unavailable, when the data is too clear, too abundant, too well documented, loyalty to the institution is no longer a position. It's a choice to disregard available information in favor of what you wish were true, and that is not something a rational 23-year-old with a fully loaded information environment is going to do. Now, I want to address the obvious objection here because it comes up every time this topic gets discussed, and it deserves a direct answer. You might be thinking, okay, but doesn't this just mean companies need to fix the contract? Offer real reciprocity, honor their commitments, rebuild the trust. Problem solved? Sort of, but there's a collective action problem baked into the structure that makes this extremely hard to do at scale. If Company X decides to be a genuinely high loyalty employer, to actually invest in people, to promote internally, to resist the efficient replacement calculation, they face a competitor who is using the low loyalty model to win on cost. The low loyalty model is cheaper in the short term. You don't invest in development. You don't pay for long-tenured employees who expect above-market wages. You cycle people at market rate, keeping compensation perpetually at the current higher rate rather than accumulating raises over time. You run lean. Company X trying to offer a genuine loyalty contract is operating a structural cost disadvantage relative to their race to the bottom competitor, and under enough market pressure, and there's always eventually enough market pressure, they break. Even the companies that start with genuine intentions eventually face a bad year where the efficient replacement logic is the only number that works. The trap is in the structure, not in the character. The people making these decisions are not in most cases villains. They are people caught in a system where the short-term incentives for contract breaking are overwhelmingly than the long-term incentives for contract keeping. And when you're reporting quarterly earnings to shareholders, long-term incentives lose. Not always, but most of the time, and consistently enough that the pattern is structural, not exceptional. This is why I keep coming back to incentives rather than individuals. The system produces the behavior. Change the incentives, you change the behavior. Yell at the individuals, you change nothing. You just feel better for a few minutes. But here's the thing that keeps this from being a simple doom narrative. Loyalty correctly priced is not zero. There are employers, fewer than advertised, more than cynics admit, where the contract is genuinely reciprocal, where staying does compound, where the relationship is real and the commitments are honored, where pressing the button on the vending machine actually produces what the label says. Those employers exist, and for those employers, genuine loyalty is the correct economic choice. Not because it feels good, because it compounds, because you build something inside that structure that is genuinely worth more after 5 or 7 years than what you'd have built through pure mercenary mobility, because the relationship produces value that mobility can't capture. The problem is identifying those employers in advance requires skills that most people don't systematically develop, reading revealed behavior versus stated values, looking at actual tenure data, not the marketing copy about culture, talking to people who left to understand under what conditions they left, doing the due diligence that converts an implicit contract into something you can actually evaluate. This is not cynicism, this is competence. The ability to evaluate a loyalty contract before you enter it is not a failure of commitment, it's the precondition for making a commitment that is actually worth making. The vending machine is not broken everywhere, it's just broken in most places, and the skill that matters, the one that separates the system builder from the mercenary and both of them from the confused loyalist, is the ability to tell the difference. Now, let me bring everything back to the original image. The contractor who doesn't answer the phone. The company that's genuinely puzzled. That gap between the company's clean narrative about a professional ending and the contractor's experienced reality of a betrayal has a technical name. It's an asymmetric contract. One side formalized the ending according to their internal process. The other side experienced the ending as the moment the contract was actually broken, which was months or years before the formal process. Two different timelines for the same event, and no one told the other party which timeline they were on. As a magic, contracts don't get fixed by telling one party to have better values, they get fixed by making the contract symmetric, which means both parties need to understand what the other party is actually agreeing to, not what they wish the other party were agreeing to. Both parties need to be operating on the same timeline, the same understanding of what the relationship actually is and what it actually requires. And here's the version of this that applies directly to how you build a financial life. There are 3 things that actually matter coming out of this entire analysis. First, do the due diligence on any machine before you feed it coins. Before you give real loyalty, your time, your skills, your years, your optionality to any employer, any partnership, any structure, look at the actual incentive system with clear eyes. What does this system actually reward? Not what does it say it rewards. What was it done to the people who came before you when they were in your position? Has it honored its implicit commitments in the past based on observable behavior, not based on its branding? This is not cynicism. Cynicism is refusing to engage. This is due diligence. It's the thing you do before any other significant financial commitment, and it should be standard operating procedure before you make an employment commitment. 2. What second? Distinguish between mobility and strategy. The mercenary path is genuinely better than the confused loyalist path. If you're choosing between the two, choose mercenary every time, but mobility is a tool, not a destination. Moving between machines efficiently means you never compound inside any structure, and at some point the compound effect is the entire game. The difference between a portfolio that returns 12% annually and one that returns 8% is not the difference between 12 and 8. Over 30 years, it's the difference between roughly $3.5 million and $1 million, assuming an initial investment of $100,000. That's the compound effect. It applies to careers and skill sets as readily as it applies to investment accounts. The goal is not to run faster between machines, the goal is to build your own machine. The third, price loyalty correctly in both directions and act on the pricing. If you find an employer who is offering a genuine contract, legible expectations, real follow-through, actual evidence that staying compounds, that's worth real loyalty, economic loyalty, rational, calculated, deliberate commitment to a structure that demonstrably works. Not sentimental loyalty, not this feels like home loyalty, the kind of loyalty that you can justify with a financial model. And on the other side, if the contract is broken, if the data is clear, if the machine has demonstrated that it eats coins without dispensing anything, leave. Not angrily, not dramatically, just clean. Update the model, move to the next machine, or start building your own. A vending machine is still out there. Most of them are broken, some of them work. Your job, your actual financial job, not your job title, is to figure out which is which before you spend your coins. That's the whole video. If you want more of this, the systems, the incentives, the real mechanics of how money moves, subscribe. I'll keep making these.